All right, we are now recording and live. So welcome everyone. My name is August Warren. I am a young progressive running as a Democrat for Oregon State Representative of House District 2. We are having this town hall to discuss the issue of housing and homelessness, which is particularly relevant here in Roseburg and across the country. And without any further ado, I will introduce the meeting or the host of this meeting, Kevin Bell.
Hi, everybody. I'm Kevin. Uh, I have been given the distinct privilege of talking to August Warren, who's our current House District 2 candidate, Dane Zahner, who just walked in, who is head of the HIV Alliance, and Mike Fieldman, who is the previous chair of UCAN, who these are some of the individuals in our community who have the outspoken knowledge of what is affecting, and not only the knowledge, but they also have the on the boots resources that really communicates with the people and sees what, a great overview of the problems. So we are going to take things pretty easy breezy. And I'm going to give this over to you, August, so you can start asking some of your questions. And then I would suggest maybe just ask them about their background. And then we can dive in from there.
Yeah, before we start with questions, I would like to just introduce or have our other meeting guests introduce themselves, potentially starting with Mike. These are our experts locally. So, Mike, if you want to give
Sure.
people your background a little bit, that'd be great.
Yeah, I'm Mike Fieldman. I'm retired a few years ago as the executive director at UCAN, the United Community Action Network. While there, we actually constructed over 90 units of affordable housing in Douglas County. Also served on the State Housing Stability Council, which was a governor appointment to the council oversees the majority of the funding that comes in and goes through the state and that goes out for the construction of affordable housing. After I retired from there, I then went and worked for about 18 months with Representative Gary Leaf. And he hired me on to specifically work on housing and homelessness as well as behavioral health issues. And it was during my time with him that we were able to get the $1.5 million out of the legislature that allowed for the construction and the startup of the Gary Leaf Navigation Center, which I think has changed the lives of some of the people who've gone through it. So I have a fair amount of background in housing. Prior to coming here, I was the volunteer, actually executive director for a housing authority up in Northeast Washington, a little town called Republic. And we actually started the housing authority, helped start the housing authority. It was the smallest housing authority in the state of Washington. I think the last one to be started. We built some housing for people with disabilities as well as for senior citizens while I was up there. And that was actually my first foray into the housing development world. Have a bit of a diversified background in various communities and housing and homelessness. So.
I appreciate that introduction. There's a lot to get into there. Next, Dane, if you want to introduce yourself.
Sure, Dane. This is Dane Zahner, he, him pronouns. My day job is with HIV Alliance, and I do prevention programs for Douglas Cooster and Josephine. I also work with our unhoused populations, helping coordinate Connecting Point, which is a resource network.
And it's kind of hard to hear. Sorry.
The resource network Connecting Point that goes out to the street 5 days a week with multiple partners. And we just, assist people that are in need. And then I also work with Onward. I'm on the board of directors of Onward, which is a small nonprofit that locally just serves our unhoused population, helping get resources such as driver's license, medical care, drive, rides to that medical care and just navigating whatever might be a gap for them out there on the street. I also work with Uncle Hart, and Uncle Hart helped facilitate in the beginning Species
Dane,
Village.
I think you're breaking up.
Am I breaking up?
Audio is really hard to hear. Sorry.
Yeah,
I'm
it's
sorry.
going in and out. It's kind of the audio.
Actually, I'm
is-
hearing him fine, so.
Really?
It's our end if it's both of us.
Yeah, my apologies. Is that better? I am driving and I apologize. I was at an event this afternoon and I couldn't get out of that. But we also work with Uncle Hart. I'm going to put my camera off and I'll put the phone up next to my mouth. But I work with Uncle Hart's, and we were the organization that started Hastings Village with the city of Sutherland safe camping location, the only safe camping location in Douglas County that is facilitating, basically a safe place to camp and get people off the streets. It was a great program. And then we've now just facilitated and working on small projects. Our project right now is taking tarp tents and sleeping bags for our unhoused population and making sure that they at least have something to get out of the weather. And that is not ideal. So, we're just trying to help carry that conversation around homelessness. And so that's kind of the things I do is a lot of street on the ground networking with people to connect people to care that are homeless.
Yeah, and August, I forgot to mention that I also helped start and was vice chair of the Roseburg Homeless Commission. That was actually did the work on getting the Gary Leaf Navigation Center up and going.
Thank you, Dane, and yeah, lots to get into there. I'd also like to give Betsy a chance to introduce herself. She's also going to be an expert joining us today. Betsy, if you're ready. You're muted.
Hello. Yeah. My experience in regard to housing, affordable housing and homelessness started in the 1980s when I was an advocate and worked on trying to address homelessness issues in the Los Angeles area. And on and off here in 2019, I started a nonprofit that is focused on the advocacy part, individual and systemic advocacy. And we try to push public policy. Also, was the driver for the local Democratic Party to pass a resolution in 2018 recognizing the right to housing and the right to rest. And so that's enough. Thanks.
All right, thank you all. Kevin, do you want to take over? Do you have anywhere to guide us, or should I just start going with some of my policy and questions?
I think your questions are going to be the best bet. I'm just here to make sure everything stays on track.
All right. Well, I guess I am by no means an expert in this field. I'm someone who's relatively new to politics, so my goal is to understand issues as honestly as I can, in the problems and solutions. So, I guess I wanted to just on the broad scale, it seems to me that there are two main ways we can divide the issue of housing up, and that is the long and the short term impacts. You have the short term, meaning people who are suffering, living on the street right now, struggling to find access to shelter, food, water, basic resources, especially healthcare, mental health care, and then access to jobs. All those things to me seem to be a part of what would be necessary to give someone a platform to build off of to get them off the street. And then in the long term, it seems to me that with the state of our economy, unless something drastically changes, we're going to keep having more and more people going without shelter who can't afford increasing rents. So it seems to me that even if we were to get everyone the resources that they need on the ground right now and end homelessness, whatever that means, there would still be the issue of an increasing amount of the population who still can't afford housing after that. So to start with, I want to deal with the on the ground issue in terms of um, what I guess I'll direct this question to you, Mike, first, and then if anybody else has anything to say, they can feel free to chip in. But do you have a sense of what the resources look like for someone who is living without shelter today in Roseburg?
I think it's mixed. In some regards, it's better than when I was at UCAN. There's more mental health and drug and alcohol treatments outreach going on than when I was there, but still not sufficient. Um, I think the one area that has been lacking is still lacking, and the city has made some efforts to try and address as a place for safe place for people to camp, an urban campground or campgrounds that would be needed. Um, and so there are, fair amount of resources that can go to help people. There's a navigation center now, so it's a mixed bag. There's some good stuff going on, but there's certainly a need for a lot more. Betsy
My
may have some Betsy may have some good thoughts on that one too.
my my answer on that, August, is I think, with the confusion of
We did lose you on.
and Sutherland went,
Dane, you are now breaking up with me too. So
Losing you.
and I think okay, I'll just come back. Sorry.
No worries.
Well, we can roll back to you because I do have a couple points, and I see that Meg has joined the room too. And Meg does outreach at least on a weekly basis with the Team Smiles and the feed.
You're muted, Betsy.
Yeah, I said Meg is in the room. And so maybe Meg would like to give some ideas because she sees people on a weekly basis at a minimum and knows a lot about what's happening out on the streets. Meg, you want to
I
unmute
guess
yourself and
yeah, I would like to get to that, but I guess I may have gotten slightly ahead of myself. I think it may be helpful to kind of just establish the baseline of what we were talking about when we say housing is an issue and homelessness as an issue, because this is something that a lot of people talk about, but I myself would love to get a bit more concrete information if we have any sort of statistics of are there more people living on the street increasingly in the last 5, 10 years? And have the resources changed that are available to them? If anyone wants to weigh in on that.
well, the resources, and I'm going to divide what I consider housing and homeless as two problems. One is how to solve homelessness. And from my perspective, housing is the only answer that solves homelessness. There may be other things needed, but you need to have housing. People need permanent housing, not temporary shelters of any kind. Our goal should be to get rid of temporary shelters. The other is how we manage homelessness. And this is where the crisis is among folks who are living outside today, is that we poorly manage homelessness. And so the problem is that people their rights are being violated. The city of Roseburg just recriminalized. What a state legislature could do is prohibit cities from doing that. So if you want from a state legislature could in fact pass a law that the right to rest would have done that. So the right to rest, so if you're looking at and resources, anybody who tells me that there's sufficient resources to meet the needs of people living outside is not telling the truth. Okay. That it is a very terrible time to be homeless in Douglas County, particularly in the city of Roseburg. That's where the majority of them, and I think Dane has some data, shared some data maybe with what he shared with Kevin, that he had shared with us earlier, the statistical data of the numbers of people who are homeless in Douglas County, the majority of whom end up, if you're talking about street level homeless, and there's a difference of homelessness, right? People are couch surfing. People are at risk they're getting evicted, so they're soon to be homeless. So there's all these people who are at risk of not having housing, or don't have housing. Those needs to be addressed. But when it comes to street level homeless, there's a particular problem and violation of their rights and their dignity, and I think is even a risk to their health and well-being.
Right. You know, I agree with a lot of what Betsy said. The fundamental issue is housing. That's what we need more of. I think though not just housing for some people, we also need more supported housing. Because there are some people who, in order to be successful in being housed, they're going to need to have support services around them to make them successful in it. But there really is just a variety of, we talk about homelessness and we tend to, I think, just think about the people on the streets, but there, like Betsy implied there and mentioned, there are a lot of different types of homelessness out there, and the solutions to the different types of homeless are going to vary upon the population we're looking at. Youth homelessness is going to look a little different. Than people who are living on the streets. So some of those are youth that are living on the streets. The recent research has shown that the largest increase in percentage-wise of homeless people now are people who are over 50 years of age. They're the elderly. There are people who have lived fine, in their lives up until now, and they're on a low fixed income. And because of the increases of rents and housing costs, they're being forced out of their homes and onto the streets. And so we're starting to see an increase in senior citizens who are being homeless for the first time. They have a very different type of need as well as solution than chronic people who have been homeless for years and years and years. People who are headed into homelessness, or at risk of homelessness, have there's a different set of responses for them than for people to help them from becoming homeless, than those who have been on the streets for years. It's a lot easier and a lot less costly to keep somebody from becoming homeless than it is to get them housed again once they are homeless. So prevention is a big piece of it. So it really is a real varied thing. We have to make sure we talk about homelessness, that we're looking at a broad spectrum of people and not just one block, one type of individual. So
Interesting point of information that Dane put in the chat that I think we should all be aware of, that it is just under 700 people in Roseburg, Sutherland, and Winston that have been identified by the Equity Coalition of Oregon. And there are no actual safe camping solutions in Douglas County. I would like to maybe hear a little bit more about that, because I know no place without a home is really a safe place. But what in Douglas County specifically makes being homeless here such a hard time? Is it the lack of services they get from the county? Is it just the people here, or is it the weather?
I sorry to cut anybody off who was going to answer, but that kind of, I guess I was leading into this a little bit, because if there are almost 700 people who are without shelter in a pretty rural area with a relatively small population, that seems like a pretty substantial issue. So I'm wondering, I know there have been some changes in policy in the works around policing and homelessness specifically, based on the recent Supreme Court case out of Grants Pass. So I was just wondering if we had anyone wanted to share some perspective on what how the government currently is approaching solving the problem of homelessness, and whether or not that is actually an effective way to go about it.
My answer would be that I don't think they're successfully doing anything. Criminalizing homelessness, as Betsy said, is not helping the situation. Some of these communities took advantage of the Supreme Court, overturning the grants pass and giving grants. So they feel like they don't need to do anything, but we have that data I put in goes into the gaps in housing. We just don't have enough housing to put people in, and low cost housing, affordable housing. I mean, until that's solved, you're not going to solve that. And the point in time count, which that data link takes you to, is done in the middle of winter. It's an unreal time to actually. Most people, if they're going to try to find some sort of shelter, that's sleeping in somebody's garage, sleeping in a trailer. And we're not really doing anything to assist that until we, like, just using that number that Connecting Point got, the 700, that did not come from the Oregon data, that came from our data. 400 for 2 years in a row. And Roseburg. So I mean, that's a real number, and I think the city number that the city commission, the homeless commission, was using was right around 150, and that's like, okay, there's a huge gap between 150 and 400. So we're somewhere lies the real number, and nobody knows that real number. The pit count is not a good count of number, and and it doesn't identify the true homelessness. And so I think our number's a lot closer. And so if you could just say 400 in Roseburg, we don't have 400 open, low-cost, affordable housing in Roseburg right now. That does not exist. And so until we solve that problem, we, are not solving any issues.
Warren, I'm not sure really if the problem in Roseburg is any different than it is, or any worse than it is anywhere else. Homelessness is a major issue all up and down the West Coast. It's a major issue in New York City. I mean, it's a major issue across a lot of places in the United States. And so, are there more people here now than there were before? Like Dane said, it's hard to get a solid picture on that. Even though the point in time count is not, it's not going to be 100% accurate. To me, that is probably a base number. It's not going to be lower than that. I mean, the pit count is accurate in that sense. It's not double counting people. There's not fewer people than what the pit count shows. If anything, there's more people than what it shows. So that just gives you sort of a base figure. I think the 150 figure that the Homeless Commission came up, and came from one of the police officers that was there who deals with the people on the street. And I think he was referring to number of people, an estimate of the number of people that they deal with on a regular basis. So I don't think that was a estimate of the number of actually homeless people in there, but it was from the police perspective what they were dealing with on a regular basis. And so it's an issue everywhere, because I don't want people to think that, oh my gosh, Roseburg is doing something that's bringing people here or causing people to be more homeless or to be a worse place than others, because I really don't think it is. Because I think it's, like I say, it's an issue across the whole state. I mean, the governor, when she first came in, declared a housing and homelessness emergency across the state of Oregon. And she did that because she was quite aware of the problem across the whole state. And so I think it's a statewide issue, and it's also a national issue that we're dealing with.
Yes,
And I would agree. I would agree with Mike. Totally. I think our weather is a little bit more mild in some areas. So the West Coast from Seattle down to San Diego has a little bit more, is because we have a better climate too.
Right. But there are communities around the country that have dealt with the issue a lot better than others. I mean, I don't know where they're at now, but a few years ago, of all places, Salt Lake City, had huge successes in dealing with the number of homeless people on the street because they made a concerted effort, a conscious effort to try and address with the homeless issue and in their community, and they basically dealt with everybody who needed housing and got it to for them, got them into services. So there are there's not plenty, but there are a handful of places around the country that have really made that very conscious, concerted effort to address it and been successful. And I think one of the common threads in all that is that the community gets unified behind it. The community says, we are going to do something about it. We are going to make this a priority. We're going to put resources behind it. We're going to put people behind it. We're going to put effort behind it. And the whole community comes together and says, okay, yes, we can make a difference in this, and we are going to make a difference. And then when that happens, like most problems, when you get a community unified and agreeing we're going to work on this together, we as a society have tended to be very successful. It's when we tend to point fingers at each other, or we say it's not our problem, or let's just move these people out, or find excuses for not doing anything. That's when nothing gets done and the problem just stays. So, I think, if we could come up with a unified, agreed to some solutions, I think we could be successful. I'm looking at Sutherland, they're not perfect, but they're have been more unified as a community in wanting to do something with housing and homelessness. There's been problems with it, but they certainly seem to have gotten a lot further along down the road than other communities in our county have.
I'm going to say that I think there is some finger pointing that needs to be done. And I think that is to hold the county, the government accountable for
Yep.
changing public policy decades ago to change the way that low income public housing was funded. And that came out of the Reagan administration.
Right.
And right now, the only way to fund most housing project is with private capital, and that creates debt. And that is not really the way that the public, housing program was set up. You provide grants, you provide the ability for them to, get income for operational expenses, but you don't have this heavy debt burden.
Right.
And the funding has been that all of these projects can opt out within a certain period of time. In the 80s, it was like 15 years was a short period of time. I know that the state legislature in Oregon is trying to make 30 and 60-year agreements. Oregon Housing Council or the Oregon Housing and Community Services and the grants that they fund. But the problem is, and I'm an advocate for public housing to be owned and operated by the government, and I mean from construction on. I think it has the most accountability for the public dollars, or potential accountability. I'm not in favor of nonprofits anymore running them, because there's not that transparency that's required when the state of Oregon or the Public Housing Authority here in Douglas County operates public housing. You can go to their meetings, you can see all their records, you can see every dime they spend. So I think that one of the problems too becomes the accountability of how do we house people when it comes to programs, let's say the navigation center. What I would see, and I have seen for years in Douglas County, is people maybe get services for a while, they get placed in housing, and some of them need exactly what Mike said, permanent supportive housing. And permanent means their entire life. It doesn't mean the 18 months of funding that the government grant gives them to support this person. So those big gaps are really what people need who are on the extreme, who need more than just a roof over their head. But I also want to say that most of the people who are at risk at housing or are homeless, like couch surfers, are people that giving them housing may be the only thing they need. And we
Right.
can't lose sight of that, because if we think we have to fix everybody in order, and that's the problem, the model for 30 years has been let's fix you first, And if you look at, in a nonprofit arena, we have a little graph that we use that shows the fail points of homeless services. And that's when a condition is put upon someone to be housed. They have to do this, so I am not even really a fan of temporary shelters, other than the crisis that we're in, and people need a place to be. They need a roof over their head. But we have worked ourselves into this by neglect.
Mhm.
The
And
only,
Betsy, and
yeah,
Betsy,
go
I
ahead.
would agree with you. I guess I just use a little different terminology. I think all the points you make are legitimate ones. We need to be able to identify the past decisions, the issues that are causing the problems today. And I think all the things that you said are legitimate issues that have led us to where we are. When I use the term pointing fingers, I guess I use it in the context as, for me, when people point fingers, they said, that's your problem, not mine. I'm not going to be part of it. You take care of it. You need to take care of your issue, and this will go away. I'm not part of the solution. And that's what I meant by that. So by that phrase when I used it. And that's what I was trying to get, the point I was trying to get across with Salt Lake. It's everybody getting behind a solution, people working together to make things happen. That's when it happens. But I agree with you. All of those things that you pointed out are part of the reasons we're here. As I was trying to think of, the whole issue of housing and how we got here, it's such a big issue. And, you and I were talking the other night, and we're sort of joking that, how many days you want to have this meeting go on if we're going to really talk about all the solutions and the issues around it, because you can go on forever with it, it seems. But as I was thinking about it, I sort of identified five sort of major categories that have caused, or where if there's problems with, or there are problems that have led to where we're at, or where the solutions lie. One is land. There's this insufficient land. Developable land is one of the things. Being able to get land to build on and to do housing with. The cost that you implied, the funding mechanisms we've had in the past, the tax credits, are extremely complicated, extremely expensive, take a long time. And, it just isn't an effective model, I don't think. So cost is an issue. The time it takes to build housing, or build a project, is another issue. Anything you can do to reduce the time it takes was going to make things better. The economics of it. Less it's less profitable. It's less for a private developer to build housing in a rural area than it is in a big city, just because they can charge higher rents in a big city than they can in rural areas. And then the service area is the other one. It's a fifth one, is there's just a lack of supportive services for the people who need it. And so there's problems in all of those five areas. There's potential solutions in all of those five areas, that would make things better. But there's such an interplay, and there's an interplay between those five areas that lead us to where we're at. So it's a complex issue. There's not easy, quick solutions to any, if there was, people would have come up with it and we'd be doing it by now.
Well, I think we actually have the ability to do it. We just don't have the will to do it. And
Right. I agree.
it really is a funding issue, and because this is a political, discussion. If we didn't give tax cuts to the rich, we could probably afford to house everybody who needs basic housing in the United
Right.
States.
Right.
So it becomes those budget priorities, right? And it really matters who's not, who's in Congress. It really matters. It really, really matters, because they're the big chunk of grant money or other money, whether it comes through HUD or the U.S. Department of Agriculture or the Veterans Administration. But the other big factor is who's in the state legislature. Because even though the city of Roseburg doesn't have to criminalize homelessness, even though the city of Roseburg could designate what I call safe ground encampments, where people, have smaller 30 or so people with resources, basic sanitation and access to resources, even though the city could authorize those things. The reality is, I do appreciate that the city I live in doesn't have the money I mean, just on its own, it does not have the money to actually solve the problem, or even better manage it, have the resources there that are needed to really make sure that people are taken care of, and the ability for them to get off the streets. It has to be permanently stay off the streets. I mean, that really has to be the goal. It's not just 18 months they get housed, and when services go away, you see things happen that ultimately end up in some of them being homeless again.
I agree. I agree. Yeah, one of them
Dane, you've
talking
had
about
your hand up.
land. Oh, go ahead, Warren.
Sorry, Dane's had his hand up
Okay.
for a little while. Let me get
Okay.
to him, and then we come back.
No, and I was just gonna touch on one of them. I think like I'll use he's
We lost you, Dane. You froze on us.
Frozen Dane.
we could have done better by having more agent peers on the ground doing those programs. But the participation from some of those agencies, they don't have those people out on the street working with the people where they're at, connecting them where they're at. It's a harm reduction solution. And I'm not talking syringes. I'm talking harm reduction, meeting somebody where they're at, going out of your office and going into like that. It was easy because all 35 people of the city of Sutherland that were unhoused were in one location. So if you can connect care, and then you can connect, that could be rebuilding a relationship with a family so that they can work back that way. Maybe that's substance use disorder. I don't know. Not everybody that's homeless is suffering substance use disorder, but some are. Some have mental health issues, and it's like the lack of mental health access. It's just, ADAPT will tell you, and there has been some great breakthroughs and treatment like Boulder Care, to help connect people online. But I can tell you, Boulder and Anonymous Health aren't a great opportunity for somebody that's out on the street because they don't have reliable telephone service. You need for online medical and you have to have online phone, a tablet, those things. You have to have Wi-Fi. And so like Sutherland, that was one of the gaps, that they don't have Wi-Fi in the village. And so if they did, that would make communication a much easier angle, where maybe telehealth would be a great way to connect people. But I really think the boots on the ground, getting people out of the office, especially the peers, connecting with them where they're at, we can have some success stories. The gaps are still going to exist, but why don't we, the model community would force some kind of tiny home subdivision to start to be established. It hasn't happened in any community in Oregon that I'm aware of. I think there's something close in Eugene right now, but that really would, just like tiny affordable homes, not looking at these bigger models or these huge complexes to house people. Just like, there's some real grassroots models that would work. And like, if we could get a community like Sutherland that already did something to move forward to designate some land where we build a little tiny home community and see, maybe that's the answer and we could show success. But I really go back to what I really wanted to say is we need more peers and community healthcare workers built into these programs to connect to people where they're at and not out of an office on the street, going out and recruiting them and finding out what they can do to help support them. Because, and those are things that, are building slowly, but not fast enough.
Right. And I agree with you. In fact, I've been an advocate for tiny homes for years. In fact, built the first 2 tiny homes in Roseburg several years ago. And it was a challenge because the building codes were not supportive of that effort. Just one example was the parking requirements. We had to have 2 parking places, in order for to meet the code for a tiny home. It just was totally unnecessary. It got changed. We were able to get around it to make that happen. But I think that's one of the things locally that could be done, is that building codes could be, and at a state level too, that could be moved, have local communities be encouraged to put them in place, is to have codes that would encourage tiny homes, other alternative building structure models that are out there. There was, the city of Roseburg was looking a while ago at putting codes together for cottage clusters, which is similar to tiny homes. And from my understanding is that they started to work on it and then it got put aside. It could be maybe they've gotten back to it. I'm not aware of it. But having those already in place so that somebody wanting to do that doesn't have to go through that process to get it there would be good. And so having that in place. The other idea, the other issue though, if we did have enough money to put everybody who's homeless and in need of housing in homes, there wouldn't be enough there for them to go into. There simply is not enough housing stock out there right now. And so we do need to be able to build things quicker and more efficiently. One of the ideas that I've had for years and is that with private industry, when community wants to attract businesses, for years they've developed what they call shovel-ready land sites for businesses and factories to move into. I think doing the same thing with affordable housing and for housing would be good, for have communities develop parcels of land that are shovel ready to do construction of housing on, which means taking care of all the environmental issues beforehand, getting the infrastructure in, the utilities in, so that somebody who wants to build housing can just move in and do it. And they're not going to have to pay the costs for all that infrastructure work, which often is a real barrier cost-wise to being able to get the housing project to pay out, to pencil out in the long run. So, I think there's some things some policy issues or some things we could do locally or statewide that could maybe increase the number, make it easier to build housing.
So I have a kind of a specific,
Go ahead.
just a specific question and then a more broad thing we can get to later. But I remember hearing the Democrats nationally are talking about the challenge being that there's too many hoops to jump through to build. So they're talking about helping, increase housing units by decreasing regulations on building housing. Um, I'm curious, I guess, is that an effective a step in the right direction, or does that seem like it would pave the way for private industry to do more profit-seeking behaviors? Because the contrast to that obviously would be fully public funded housing. And to me, it seems there are a few issues such as healthcare and housing, which are fixed goods. Demand for housing is directly relevant to how many people need a house. So it seems to me that private interest in trying to profit off of housing is fundamentally incongruous with providing housing to people who are struggling to afford housing. So for me personally, it seems if it were possible to fund public housing, that would be more more in line with the values and goals that we're trying to achieve. So I guess the long-winded way of getting about this question is, does can either regulation or deregulation motivate private industry to actually develop affordable housing, or is it something to write off that there's private industry can't make any money doing actually affordable housing, so therefore they're just fundamentally not going to be able to do it?
I think it depends on what level that they're at, what level of income. So if somebody's 100% or below the poverty level, there's no way housing affordable at 30% of their income is ever going to be able to be made in private industry. And that's to me the shame of the low income housing tax credit, because you're trying to keep those people involved in that situation. It is probably, but I do know that one of the things that maybe a lot of people don't know is even the housing authority has to pay system development fees, right, when they build housing. So one public entity is charging another public entity. And I know so one of the things of our own housing authority, and they do have land in certain places in their jurisdiction, is that cost of, the cost from the development fees to the cost of building. And I know the one thing that, when we started a nonprofit in 2019, one of the things that we were promoting, there was two models. One is, Community First in Austin, Texas, has, 20 some acres where they started out as a mobile home park, right? And then they built onto that. So that's a model that I always suggest people look at, because they also create a cottage industry within this process. And it's been around for quite a while and is very successful. But the other thing that appealed to me is a block project they were doing up in Seattle, which is using the accessory dwelling unit, AKA a tiny home, or it could be an addition over your garage, an apartment over your garage, that to facilitate those where people took someone who was homeless and dedicated that property and the ability to take it in their own single family dwelling lot and have that. We actually have the legal ability to do that in the state of Oregon and in Roseburg specifically. One of the things I do know for the accessory dwelling unit, because when I first started to look into that, I talked to the city, this has been a few years, and they would be fine with that, doing that. But for a homeowner, who's going to bear that cost? And then what does that mean for a homeowner? So it could cost like $6,000 to put in the septic, the sewage connection in the city of Roseburg for an accessory dwelling unit. So the fee can be very high. So if a homeowner was even willing to allow a project, let's say a nonprofit or the government paid for the tiny home, they would also have to pay for all this infrastructure. And the problem is, composting toilets are perfectly fine, but they're not legal to have them. Well, you can have them, but if you live in a city like Roseburg, you still have to pay for the development fees to connect to the sewer system. So you can't even use things that theoretically would cut cost, right, of the actual development. And I think that that is something that Roseburg could do. That is something Sutherland to do. Anybody that has a city, even the county, although there's land use laws about larger parcels that are a little more complicated in the county. But that's a solution, is that not a village, but in our village, our bigger village, having people in the community. And the block project still exists up in Seattle, as far as I know.
Yeah, we ran into those system development fee costs when we did our two tiny homes too. It was just very expensive for two tiny homes. Yeah, and there needs to be different ones for that. So.
Thank you both for that. I a slightly different, so somewhat of a similar vein, but I've also heard discussion about whether it's more effective to build new housing units or repurpose existing structures, because there are so many empty buildings. Obviously, that is very complex with ownerships of that land or buildings. But I guess would it be most effective to pursue whatever works in a situation? Are there areas where there are more unused lots, or is it something where we just have to say, no, we need to build entirely new places?
I think I don't know if there's one answer to that. I think it depends on the circumstances of what you're trying to remodel. Sometimes building new is cheaper than remodeling. Sometimes remodeling is cheaper than building new. And what is you're building new. So I don't think there's a definitive answer to that. So, but I think, your building codes and your zoning can impact your ability to do those types of things in commercial, or in industrial areas. I think there is in Roseburg, there's not a lot of developable land, flat developable level land. And so I think somehow the city and the state need to look at ways of making more of that available. Because without the land, you can't build. So
And I was just
go ahead, Dave.
August, I was gonna add to that is like, as a legislator, I think working with a community like Sutherland, I think they have been working on the ADUs. HTAG has a subcommittee, and that's been one of our focus points. And Sutherland has been, because they're cooperative with the Hastings Village. But that's where a legislator could maybe work with a community to develop the infrastructure, the law changes to be in place. And why I say Sutherland is you have that community behind them, so that is an important piece, and maybe that would raise the bar for some of these other. But I think if we could get one community within this district to change forward and do something, it would be very, we could use that as a model for other communities, because Winston's facing the same thing as Roseburg, which is facing the same thing as Cottage Grove and Reedsport, and they're all facing these things. So if you can get a model community, change the infrastructure and the laws, that might be what could push it forward and go, hey, look at it. Because I use Sutherland as an example a lot. Is like, hey, look at what Sutherland did. They offered a safe camping location. Wouldn't that be cool in Roseburg? And it does facilitate, and you got to be careful on how many people you put in a location when you got to kind of cap that number. So like Roseburg is going to have multiple locations, because if you put too many people with mental health issues, substance use disorder together, that can cause some issues. So, but I think also like one thing that was touched on earlier, and I again touched on the peer and community healthcare workers, is once you get one of these facilities going, having that supportive. It's hard to take somebody from homelessness to housed. And, so I think that's often forgotten. And the success of keeping somebody housed is the support that they need and making sure that happens. That there is some mental health resolved and continued. And, with substance use disorder, all those things need to be taken into consideration once you get one of these models built. And is often forgotten. It's like, oh, we got them housed, but there is no support after that. And it's like they struggle and then they're back out on the street. And that is not a better model for us. So I think it's like really looking at all the details of each situation as we get this. But I think I go back to finding a model community like Sutherland that might be an example where we can change everything, get all the infrastructure, maybe find a piece of property there, develop one of these, and then we can use that as a model for other communities in Oregon.
Right.
Well, the accessory dwelling unit actually addresses the lack of land, right? Because you're talking about building them on already existing single family dwelling lots. So the land is there, so that helps solve that problem. But August, I wanted to address the national policy that you mentioned that the Democratic candidate has come out or they're talking about changing the regulation. One of the things that Oregon did do that I think that they are talking about nationwide is we have changed land use laws. So you can no longer, avoid building more housing in single family lots. So, I mean, there's some exceptions, but Oregon at least moved forward to do that, to address the problem. And one of the big barriers to affordable housing has been our desire to live that suburban single family dwelling lot life. And that really does, limit what is allowed in that general neighborhood, not just in an individual lot. But Oregon has moved forward to change that. Whether it substantively change the development of housing, I don't know, but at least it's a step in the right direction.
Right. And I agree with that, but again, that's going to be one of the things that's going to take time. And that's the time issue because, in order for that to happen, people have to move out of their house, their single homes, and somebody has to buy the property who wants to develop it into, duplex, triplex, fourplex, whatever. And then also the accessory dwelling unit, yes, it provides land, but a lot of people, you have to have people who are willing to do that too. And so I think there's only been, even though you can do that in Roseburg, if I remember correctly, there's only been one family that has decided they've wanted to make use of it. So even though the land's there, the people aren't going to always be willing to do that. I want to back up, though, if I could, to our previous discussion about the affordability of affordable housing, and I agree that if you're looking at trying to make a project pay for itself when you're limiting someone to 30% of their income. So if they have no income, they're not paying anything for rent. It's an impossible model. It just doesn't work. And we saw that at UCAN. We were losing money on our projects, for years, and still are, as far as I understand, because you just you can't generate enough revenue to do the maintenance, to provide the staff and do everything you have to do. The one model that I think does work, and where I somewhat agree with Betsy, the role for the federal government, is that the one program I think that has been successful is the Section 8 program, because what it does is it subsidizes people with rent up to 30% of the what's normal rent in the community, though there's some problems with that. But I think subsidizing people's rent is what is going to make the housing situation work, not only for the people who are in the homes, but then for the people who own the affordable housing. Because you have to generate the revenue. In other words, the housing is going to deteriorate and it's not going to be affordable. And so that's why a lot of for-profit people don't get into it, why nonprofits have ended up getting into it. It's going to continue to be, it would be a problem even if government owns it. If there isn't some type of rent subsidy or subsidy for the maintaining of the property, the models that we have out there simply won't work. The other thing about Section 8 that is nice is that there's two different types of Section 8. One is a place-based, it stays with a given unit or a given project. The other one is one that stays with the person, and they can take it around wherever they want to, and find a landlord who's willing to take it, which can be a problem, but that there are some ways to address that. It opens up the opportunity for someone to live wherever they want to, rather than just in a subsidized housing unit. And so the thing is, though, is that the federal government has cut back on those subsidies over the years substantially. And I think that needs to be, that is to me a real possible, real important solution, and something the state could get into. I mean, there's no reason the state couldn't provide the type of same voucher that the federal government does. So.
One of the problems with the Section 8, and I live in a project-based Section 8
Right.
housing right now, and I have lived on there was a certificate program when I had kids, and we had it for a while. That subsidizes the real estate speculation of investments because it is usually the private market, and your housing is still vulnerable. And so even though it sounded good on paper and when it was introduced, it was to kind of de-ghettoize, the public housing and the social experiment sounded good on paper. But in the reality is if the Section 8 doesn't keep up with the real estate speculation, somebody's not going to be getting it. So we're more and more of our tax dollars are going to subsidize people making a profit off low income housing. And so I think, given what we currently have, you're right, Mike, but I think we have to look to the future and how some of this needs to totally rethought about. And I'm not saying that's going to even happen in my lifetime, but that is what probably needs to, particularly for people who are even 150 or percent or less of the poverty line, because we're not even in Douglas County. A one bedroom right now, low income tax credit property is $900 a month. SSI is $493, period.
Right.
So without that additional, so our subsidized housing can't house people without another subsidy.
Right.
So that's
Exactly.
the pickle
Yeah.
we're in.
And I did not mean to imply that those programs were perfect and weren't without its own problems, but of the solutions that are out there now that exist now, I think that's probably one of the better options, and it certainly could be improved on. I agree. So.
Well, one of the goals of my campaign is to communicate with people about how all of these issues are so completely interconnected and related to one another, especially the issues that I've chosen to focus on in my campaign. And when we're talking about housing in particular, I think that housing is in a vicious circle along with healthcare and workers' rights in particular, when it comes to all being issues of poverty, especially. There's so many statistics we could pull about. One that I've quoted a ton recently is that I think over 60% of working people can't afford a $600 expense out of pocket, be it a healthcare emergency or a car breaking down, which then you can't get to work if you can't fix your car. So there's so many ways that people can get pulled down into the quagmire. And then once you're stuck there, whether you have an illness or an injury that you can't treat, there's so many ways that being poor will actually prevent you from being able to work. And then once people are homeless with the new criminalization that's coming in, we're gonna smash these people with fines and then criminal charges and potentially jail time on the third offense, which makes it only that much harder for them to get a job or be able to afford rent. So in my view, a big part of this issue is, um, like many people have said, the issue, we make progress when we come together as a community and say, okay, this is something we're going to take care of. But an important other part of that involves, as Dane was talking about, meeting these people where they're at, acknowledging their situation honestly, and not trying to say, we're going to help you, but it's going to be on our terms, because I think that's the approach that has been taken, and that is a big part of the reason why we're seeing so little change overall. So we had some statistics in the chat that were kind of demonstrative of that, which is 23% of children live in poverty in Douglas County, and then 14% poverty overall. So I think there is a big attitude amongst a lot of people, and this is more speculation, but I think a lot of people are comfortable with the criminalization of homelessness because there's an idea that that's only something that lower class or poor people struggle with, and it could never be me. But I think it's important to recognize for that is going to be the reality for more and more people. For people, I think there's an association that homeless people are somehow deserve their situation because they're either lazy or morally flawed in some way, so they deserve to suffer like they do, which I then often hear used in arguments as to why we shouldn't provide people any services. Um, that was a lot there, so I don't know if there's anything anybody wants to pick up on there, but I guess the broad strokes is on the more social side. Is there anything we can do to get rid of that stigma, and allow for real connection and community, as opposed to just policing and kind of cruelty and harshness? And then a second question to that, specifically the position that I'm running for is state representative. So I know this is kind of entirely separate, but um, does anybody have any input as to what would be most effective for me to do from my position, were I to be elected?
Well, I think what you're referring to is an old argument that's gone on for decades, if not centuries. You can go back to the 1800s when some of the first social service programs were developed, the concept of deserving poor and undeserving poor. And that has been with us forever. And it's not just the United States and other places around the world too. And so if people see somebody as a deserving poor, then they're willing to help out. And if they're undeserving, then they don't want to. And so we've had some success. I mean, people have, decided that veterans shouldn't be homeless. And so we've had some real success in making an impact on veteran homelessness. And when you talk about helping veterans, you tend to generate a lot of support from the community. I mean, the housing that we developed on the VA campus was very well supported within the community, because people saw veterans as deserving of that. What I referred to earlier is that the data is showing that the largest percentage of new people becoming homeless who've never been homeless before are the elderly. To me, and they're people who've been successful their whole life. It just the circumstances of not enough income and the increase in rents of forcing them into homelessness. I think it'd be hard for people to not see them as deserving and doing something else. So the extent to which we can build a framework around people that they deserve the services, you're probably going to get community support. Unfortunately, and not saying that's the right and that's the way it should be. It's just sort of the reality of what it is. I think as a legislator, some of the things we brought up, ideas we brought up, are things that could be done. The idea of shovel-ready housing projects, having more rent subsidies for people, or subsidizing the housing that is out there, because it's not going to support this way it's developed now. It's not going to be able to last forever, that the way it needs to be. So
Go ahead, Dane.
I agree with Mike 100%. I think there's two populations if we could get people to care about, is our youth and our older adults.
Right.
And because when you look at that youth number, just go backwards, and there's two parents. So if there's an unsheltered youth, that means there's three people, actually, because there's a mom and dad out there, and there's something wrong if their child is out on the street. And so, but I think one thing that we don't see from legislators is community meetings, calling people together, having that frequency, and then asking, and just building a relationship, boots on the ground with our community members. And that's not something we see in our county. And I think that would be, asking those questions, educating them on the real, like, hey, here's your community and here's the reality, and let's discuss it. Let's discuss some solutions, because, that way you're listening, you're hearing, and then taking some action from that. And I think people do care. And so, it could be doing frequency. I think upping the frequency, going into some of our rural communities and having some community meetings, and just, offer some education of the, here's the statistics about Drain, Oregon as an example, and what can we do? And, when people hear about kids and adults, they're going to go, I want to help. I want to solve this. And maybe that's the grassroots is one of the way to get it done.
One of the things I was working with Representative Leaf, that was a big thing for him. And unfortunately, we weren't able to accomplish it before he passed away, is he was also a very big advocate for tiny homes. And he was trying to get funding into our community to build a tiny home community village, and to be the model for how it could be done, and to show how the impact it could have for other communities. So I think if we could get funding into the community for a tiny home village as a model, be it in Sutherland, be it in Roseburg, wherever, I think that would be a real win, because the state has not really been willing to embrace that housing model for as a priority. There's some there's some funding that can be used for it, but not specifically. And so I think that's a real gap, a real lack. And it's a model that would be good for the people that Dane are talking about, people on the streets. Also be an excellent model for seniors, be a model for kids, for youth, and part of that too are kids aging out of the foster care system. They are really at risk for becoming homeless simply because they don't have a place to go live. And so, and tiny homes can be built quickly. They can be built with volunteers. And that's another barrier with a lot of the funding streams that come from the state and from the federal government. It's next to impossible to use volunteers, to bring your costs down, and build your community support for what you're doing. And so the extent to which you can use volunteers, I think, is beneficial too. So I think there's a lot you could do as a legislator that would be real positive for our community. And I agree with Dane, getting out into the community and having the conversation is a good place to start. I think that it takes the leadership of a community to really move the needle. That actually was sort of was my hope with forming the homeless commission, that it would become a voice, take some leadership and the dialogue and leading that dialogue in the community. It didn't quite happen the way I had envisioned it, but I think it takes that leadership at the leadership voice in our community to move the needle forward.
Thank you very much. Well, we were hoping to have some people who are living without shelter participate in this meeting so they could share some of their experiences. But as you can imagine, their lives are quite hectic, and so we didn't get them here. But I did just want to share a little bit about a few experiences I've had talking with homeless people in Sutherland and in Roseburg. And just simply say that the conditions that these people are suffering through and are being put through is completely inhumane, unsustainable, not suit for life. People are being consistently harassed and told to move around town. That's why we've talked about, give people a consistent place to camp, because people can only have their tents up from 8 p.m. until 8 a.m. and then they have to move somewhere else. They're consistently told to camp different places if they're given anywhere to camp. And as we kind of mentioned earlier, the new legislation states that it's now a crime to sleep outside, including in your car, which can only be enforced selectively. There's no way to enforce that across the entire population. So I don't know. It frustrates me that we're in a situation where um, we have to have emotive stories from homeless people themselves for people to believe how awful the conditions they're being put through are. But that's kind of where we're at, where people they consistently have their things stolen, whatever possessions they can accumulate. They're stolen or ruined consistently, whether by other homeless people or the police. Yeah, it's hard to describe the level of dehumanization that people are subjected to, and it's one of the many things that um, made me want to run, because I'm not comfortable with people suffering this much in my community or any community. And fundamentally, even if you are cold-hearted and don't care about the physical or emotional suffering of this large number of people in our community, it's going to impact our economy with people not being able to work. It's going to impact the just the entire future of our community. It leads to people dying earlier than they should. It leads to people not being able to be active and reinvest in our community or contribute to our community or economy, or in general. The most important thing for me is just it doesn't allow people to live free and fulfilling lives as I believe the Constitution promises. So yeah, I wish that we had some people here to share their own experiences, but I just wanted to say that because on a personal level, it is pretty deeply moving and unsettling to see what um, what people are put through when they're living right beside us on the road and we drive by them every day. So that kind of compassion is, I think, what we need in seeing these people as human beings who are deserving. Everyone is a deserving person, whether they're poor or not. Um, that's how we create the kind of community that will last into the future. So that was a bit of a ramble, but that's kind of my general campaign view position on the more personal side of homelessness and housing. I believe everyone deserves food, shelter, water, safety. The basics should be fully guaranteed in this country. We do have 10 minutes left on the scheduled Zoom, so I don't know if there's anything else that anyone has been itching to get to or thinks is important to bring up? Or I can find another question if not.
I think I put in the chat is like a lot of times I think with all these programs that we've been discussing, the client centered part of that is lost. And everything should go back to, is this truly helping somebody? And, you know, I mean, we got four people here tonight are housed, we're sheltered, we're not living on the street. And I think that, you know, you really have to think is like, and I think that voice of the unhoused and going out there, I know UHA did a really good job with their surveys this last time, and I helped UHA out at Hastings Village with their team. And we were just taking a list, you know, of all the different opportunities that were brought forward that weren't, you know, just said, hey, you know, all we can do is take this to the leadership of the community. We did, you know, and we got answers and went back. And I think that sometimes just taking the time to listen, talk, hear them out, because that doesn't happen. As you said, when you drive by on the street, you know, most people don't stop. They don't ask, they don't engage. And these are just wonderful human beings that just happen to be living on the streets. And when you actually engage with them, they see that you care, and you may not have the answers, but they do know that you care by taking the time to acknowledge that your existence, and that's important. And you know, that is a simple way to make it a real thing for people, is just acknowledgement, and that they're a human. You see them, you may not change that outcome, but they do care about that too.
Yeah, I appreciate that. One perspective that I think is important, as you're saying, with the client-centered aspect, is like the way that the United States has dealt with drug addiction for since the war on crime is, or the war on drugs, sorry, different war, but is to criminalize it, try and shame. I mean, there's a huge social stigma around addiction. People are cut off from their families because of it. People are put in jail, and studies that have been done as objectively as possible have found that that's just about the worst thing you can do to someone: isolate them, forcibly detox them, and then, of course, there's drugs in jail, or you relapse right when you get back out. And the long-term success of people who are trying to quit whatever they're addicted to is highest, or is most correlated with their connection to community. When people have connection to their family and the support of their loved ones, or just any sense of community, really, when people have a sense of hope that there is an opportunity for them to get a job and make some money, or there is an opportunity for them to have a stable shelter. What people are most likely and are most vulnerable to being stuck in that cycle, whatever it is, addiction in this case, housing, when they feel there is no hope. That's what always pushes people back to addiction, because they're running from the idea that there's nothing for them. So when it comes to housing, that's my perspective on the criminalization of people living without shelter. Is you're trying to I mean, the quote from Grants Pass is, we want to make it uncomfortable as possible for people to be homeless here, so they just go somewhere else. And shepherding homeless people to other places is not dealing with the problem. It's just going to be a problem somewhere else. Whereas if we can make a concerted effort to embrace everyone in our community, show them that they have our support. And this doesn't mean that you just give everyone blank slate to, you know, you don't give everybody checks, but I think giving everyone opportunities, giving people access to job training, giving people the same access to physical and mental health care, and then, as we've said many times, basic safety and shelter. That, to me, that's the American dream, to have a platform to build off of. And to me, that is what is by far most effective if your goal is actually to rehabilitate them into a stable, physically, mentally healthy place, is by giving them the opportunity to get there, as opposed to taking it away from them by the virtue that they're homeless, so they don't deserve that opportunity.
Mm. The one statement that raises the hairs on the back of my neck more than any other is when I hear people say, well, people have chosen to be this way. They've chosen to be homeless. And I really have to bite my tongue and figure out how to respond in an appropriate way for it. Because, before getting into the line of work I'm in now, my early career direction was youth and adolescent counseling and working with kids and work with YMCA's and boys clubs and got halfway through a master's degree in guidance and counseling. So I worked with a lot of kids and worked, in a lot of kids programs. And I can honestly say, in all that time working with all those kids and all the people who worked with kids for years and years and years and years and years, I never once heard a kid when you're asked, what do you want to be when you grow up? They want to say, oh, then they have them say, I want to be homeless, an addict, and have mental health problems when I grow up. That's what I want. Nobody chooses it. It's, people, if given the choice, given the opportunity, given the right resources, don't want to live on the street. They don't want to live the way they live. In Seattle, went to a place that was developed that was looking at housing. They specifically were looking at the highest utilizers of services in downtown Seattle to get them off the streets. And they had, I think, developed a facility with like 85 units, something like that. And people told them they were crazy. So you're not going to get them off the street. People want to be there. You want to know how many people they had when they finally went and asked them how many people they had to ask before they filled 85 units? 87. Only 2 people said, I don't want it. The other 85 said, yeah, get me off the streets, get me in a safe place, get me the services I need. And they did it in the right way. So people don't want to be there. And so if we need to remember that these are human beings that don't want to be where they're at. And it's our challenge to figure out how do we create the situation, the environment where they can be successful and get off the street.
And that's an argument I've heard many, many times in many different forms is the people don't want help or people are choosing to live on the street. Um, and even if that were true, people seem to think that that is an argument saying that therefore we should give no one services.
Right.
That like even if there is one person that you talk to that says, oh, I don't actually want to, I'm happy with living on the street, I don't want any assistance, that has no relevance to the other 99 people who are going to be wanting services. So that is, yeah, that's an argument that really frustrates me when I do hear it, and I do hear it surprisingly often.
Right.
But
Right.
I think there is also an element to which a lot of homeless people, especially probably the longer they've been homeless, the more thoroughly rejected they feel by society at large, the more they're discriminated against, and also likely the more they're, if there is a mental health condition or a physical health condition or an addiction problem, spending more and more time on the street is probably only going to worsen that, which will likely worsen any sort of discrimination that they face. So it's kind of a self-fulfilling prophecy where people who are comfortable tell themselves that they don't want help, and then people who are suffering have asked for help and had their hands knocked away so many times that they don't even want to interact with the system anymore. So I can kind of understand both sides of it, but to me, it's absurd that people use any sort of form of that argument to say we shouldn't provide any services. So yeah, I completely agree.
And the thing is there's a cost to our society whether we do something or not. Not only the moral and ethical cost, but the dollar and cents cost to us. Because, if we're not, if people are on the streets, we're paying for them ultimately the medical costs. We're paying for the incarceration costs. I mean, I don't know what it is the cost for putting someone in jail a night, but it's probably 60, $70 a night. And then you have the medical costs that go along with it and everything else. There was an article years ago that I read that really informed me, and you can Google it. It's called $1 Million Murray. If you haven't read it, you should read it. It's a fascinating article. And it was a guy named Murray who lived down in the LA area, and who had been homeless for, I think a decade or two. And they went back and looked at the costs for all the services, and they had provided to him medical services, the incarcerations, everything else. And over the years, they realized they had spent over $1 million on this one person, dealing with all the issues that, they have that confronted him and how society had to address it. And they realized for that amount of money, they probably could have put him up in the Ritz Hotel for the whole time for less money than what they spent dealing with all the societal costs that they have for it. And so it's not a free lunch to not do anything. We pay for it one way or the other. And I think, a lot of places and a lot of people in society have realized we're paying for it one way or the other. And it's better to pay for it in a way that's going to ultimately solve the solution rather than constantly putting Band-Aids on it. So.
And
Well, and
that,
I always
like,
thought, I always thought that that was the way that you were going to convince people, not the humanity of the
Right.
children or the oldsters or the veterans, is
Right.
that if you look at people who say they're fiscally conservative, well,
Right.
one of the things I think the legislature could do is require any city that gets any money for being able to account for those dollars they spend. I would actually like to see the city of Roseburg, what they spend on these sweeps, the police interaction, not just the medical costs, but how much of our tax dollars are being used out of the budget to police. And if you listen to the scanner in Douglas County, which I do relatively frequently, that a lot of calls for service are around people who are living on the streets and not real and committing crimes that are more nuisance crime, behavior crimes, not real crimes that most of us really want to not be victimized by.
Right.
yes. I don't want to keep anybody too long, so I want to start wrapping it up. I want to give everybody a chance to share their final thoughts, but just kind of a point piggybacking on that. I think that it's pretty clear to me that the United States as a country has a problem investing in solving problems that aren't either rewarding in the short term or more directly profitable in the short term, and particularly issues of housing, and also healthcare and environmental issues, are not going to show you a direct profit off your investment, but the purpose of spending that money is to benefit and like ensure that your community will continue to survive. It's an investment in the future. It's an investment in your people, and I don't see any more perfect reason for the government to exist than to take care of those things that don't quite align with the profit motive, or aren't necessarily as directly rewarding or obvious in terms of things that we want to take care of. But like you said, it's far more expensive in the long term to arrest someone repeatedly, which also ensures that they never get a job contributing back to the economy. There are so many ways that the current system that we're enforcing and continuing to go along the road further down is not only unhelpful, but actually far more expensive and more costly, in both the short term and the long term. So yeah, I think it's important to invest in things that are healthy for the community, regardless of whether there's a direct profit. The goal should be whether people are finding their way back into housing and staying there, or whether our forests are more healthy overall. Because these are things that, profit or not, are going to dictate whether we have a community left in 40, 50 years.
Right.
With that being said, I've done a lot of rambling on this call, so I want to give everybody else a chance to share their final thoughts, if they have any.
Well, first of all, I want to thank you, August, for bringing this together. Part of what we mentioned earlier, part of creating the solutions is having the dialogue, having the discussion. And of course, it'd been nice if there could have been more people on the call with us, but you know, hopefully once we post this, people will hear it and will generate some thoughts and actions for people. So I want to thank you for doing it. I think the other solution, you know, one of the ultimate solution to this, the climate, everything else, in a lot of ways, is a political one. I mean, the way things happen is when the voters and the people in society say, we want change, and they go to their elected officials and say, we want change. And if they don't do it, then say, we're going to put somebody in there who will make that change. And so ultimately, it really does require, you know, that political will across our society and across our communities to make the change happen. The problem with the homeless and low income people, or especially with the homeless, is they, you know, for the most part, don't vote. They aren't a constituent, a power constituency. There are many people with money, many people with a lot more you know, than throughout the country that have a lot of political clout, and they tend to carry the weight. Somehow that balance has to be changed.
And I also just wanted to thank you, August. And, you know, I think we talked a lot about bringing the human side to homelessness, and that we have our fellow humans are lost out there, and a good leader can bring these things together. And I just appreciate you bringing this topic of the discussion to the table tonight. And, you know, I really think being involved in the community as a leader is an important piece of that. So that would be my, you know, community meetings, community education, and challenging us to be better humans.
And I'll just say, you know, I second what both Mike and Dane said.
Gosh, let's put it in the my calendar today. Betsy agreed with me.
I agree with you a lot. You just remember when I don't.
I know, and vice versa, Betsy. So.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody for coming out and giving August an update. I would like to remind everybody who might be live streaming this or who will be listening to this in the future that will be upcoming town halls in the future. Oh crap, I don't have the paper in front of me, but do you know the dates, Betsy?
It's every Sunday.
Yeah, go ahead, August.
It's just the next 3 Sundays, planning on doing at 5:30 again. So it should be, what is it? Let's see if I can do math. 13th, 20th, and 27th.
That's right.
Does that sound
And
right?
what are the topics that we're looking at?
The order I'm got election integrity and voting, economic and environmental sustainability, a general discussion, and then yeah, the general will be just a bit more about myself, a chance to ask questions or talk about my own policies.
Okay, great.
So yeah, thank you all for coming. I learned a lot tonight. I feel like we had some good discussion, and we will be posting this online for more people to see. I appreciate all the work that you guys have done in our community and educating me a little bit. So yeah, we will be back next Sunday. Anybody have anything else?
I'm going to say that if people see this online and have questions, they can probably the best way to want to talk to any of us, probably the best way to get in touch with us is through the Douglas County Democratic Party office and contact them and would be able to make that connection.
Yes, and if anyone listening to this is interested in helping out in any way on this issue, the more people we have, the louder our voice is. So don't be afraid. We're a friendly bunch here at the Douglas County Democrats. So come to the office, give us a call, email my campaign. However you want to help out, we will gratefully accept it. So again, thank you all for coming tonight, and I think I'm gonna wrap it up.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Bye, everybody.
back.